It started as a simple and, without doubt, honourable thought. The chance to do good, to recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution. But then politics took over. The proposed voice to Parliament is now mired in complication and confusion, with fear being used to fuel almost certain failure. Instead of being history-making, the referendum is set to be nation-dividing. So, how and why did it come to this? As the red dust, beating sun and open roads suggest, we're a long way from Canberra. And Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price couldn't be happier about it.
So what's it like for you, coming back home, the land and the people? What does it mean to you?
It's great. It's like taking a big sigh. As soon as I step off the aeroplane, I breathe in that clean, fresh desert air.
It is beautiful.
Yeah.
For Jacinta, the outback is the heart of Australia, but too often forgotten. In the small Northern Territory town of Tennant Creek, believe it or not, this is the biggest day of the year. A public holiday has been declared so everyone can enjoy the annual show.
Life's a lot different in places like Tennant Creek, and there are a lot of problems and issues. You know, there's a lot of sense of powerlessness as well.
Amid the Big Dippers and Dagwood dogs might seem a strange place to talk politics, but these are the communities, the people, the government promises will be heard and helped if the nation votes to change the Constitution later this year. The government wants Indigenous Australians to be recognised in our founding document and given their own voice to Parliament. But the no vote is way ahead, with the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs convinced the voice will only make life more difficult.
I think it would create more red tape, more processes to go through.
I think a lot of Australians expect that most, if not all, Indigenous communities would get behind the voice, given that it's this idea of having more power, having more say in policies that affect everyone.
We don't all think as one homogenous group of people. I think recognition most Australians could get behind, including myself. But the fact that the voice is latched onto this is deeply concerning because it is an absolute unknown entity. We don't know what its functions are, how it'll operate, how people will be appointed or elected.
In relation to First Peoples, should we not have the ability to give you advice?
Standing up for First Nations people has been a lifelong endeavour for Noel Pearson. But he's on the other side of the debate, leading the Yes campaign.
History calls upon us to lead.
The Aboriginal activist helped design the model for The Voice, which would see 24 Indigenous Australians elected to advise the government before it makes decisions affecting their communities.
This is a very modest idea. And of all of the things that Indigenous Australia could ask of the rest of the country, this is the most modest ask. It's saying, put us in the Constitution. Give us an ability to make representations to the Parliament about the laws and policies made about us. And that is the kind of recognition that we seek to be part of the Australian Commonwealth.
How would The Voice change everyday life in practical day-to-day terms?
Well, The Voice helps us put the policies to the government, because as long as government's been telling us what the policies should be, they haven't been working.
At town hall meetings around the country, Noel's on a mission to convince people to back The Voice. But so far, it's not working. The polling is disastrous. Support for the Yes campaign is at an all-time low of 44%, with voters worried The Voice will be ineffective or wield too much power.
When you do see some of that recent polling that shows the majority of Australians would vote no, what would change their minds?
What would change their mind is if we focus on the promise that lies in front of us. I expect that the governments and parliaments of the future will listen to sensible advice. Whenever advice is provided that is not sensible, I expect the parliament and government to reject it, as it should.
Let me put some no concerns to you then while I've got you. And these have come from literally people at the pub, family members, people who have emailed us. Under The Voice, Australians will have to pay a percentage of GDP to The Voice every year.
Absolute nonsense.
Rubbish?
Rubbish.
Okay. Australians will be forced to pay land tax, royalties to The Voice.
Nonsense.
Can't happen?
Can't happen.
Why not?
We're not a decision maker here. The Parliament and the government are the decision makers. The only people who can levy taxes or anything like that, make policies, is the government. All The Voice has is to make representations. Those are just outlandish fear campaign ideas.
From the outback to the city, it seems there's one thing everyone can agree on. So far, billions of dollars in funding and decades of talking have failed to close the gap. And the reality is, the fate of Indigenous Australians, who make up just 3% of the population, is now in the hands of the rest of the country.
Yeah, I'm a family for years.
And why is that?
Well, the young people need to get involved, get work and get a job instead of breaking in and doing, stealing and doing something like that.
In Tennant Creek, a lot of locals have no idea what The Voice is. We found the only people willing to speak on camera plan to vote yes regardless, because help in any form is desperately needed.
What do you think The Voice will do for your community?
Hopefully something.
If they're going to help the community, yeah, and if they're not going to help the community, wasting time.
Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price says plenty of people share her concerns about The Voice, but are too scared to declare it publicly.
You know, a lot of non-Indigenous Australians feel like they're going to be viewed as racist if they vote no. And that to me is wrong. You know, there is a lot of goodwill in Australia, and that's what the Yes campaign are banking on, that goodwill and the sense of even guilt because of our nation's history, and a way to sort of right wrongs as opposed to actually achieving anything of any practicality on the ground.
So if The Voice to Parliament is not the answer, what is? What is needed?
Is. We need politicians to stand up and do their job, because elected parliamentarians such as myself, there's 227 of us, are paid by the taxpayer to understand what those needs are on the ground and to advocate for them, and if you're in government, to actually act upon them. So I think it's a cop-out to suggest that The Voice is going to be the be-all, end-all for all our issues when we know what they are.
Maybe not the be-all and end-all, but isn't it a step in the right direction?
It hasn't been explained to me why it's a step in the right direction.
The Voice will play a fundamental role in terms of not allowing government to kind of shift focus off these issues and leave them neglected, out of sight, out of mind.
What happens, Noel, if it fails? What does that look like?
Oh, we'll have a major feeling of regret and sorrow at what we could have had and we didn't get there.
And we only have to look across the Tasman to get an idea of what we could have if the referendum succeeds.
How does it work? Is it effective?
Inside New Zealand's parliament, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more passionate Kiwi than Rawiri Watiti.
Proud to be Māori.
He's so proud of his Maori heritage, it's represented with great honour on his face.
So in our culture we call it moko. This is my qualification, it's my curricula vitae, it's the CV.
If you look closely enough, Rawiri's Moko will tell you he's trusted to speak on behalf of all Maori as the co-leader of the Maori Party. He's paying close attention to Australia's upcoming referendum to establish an indigenous voice to Parliament, because New Zealand has a similar system and he can't imagine life without it.
What's good for indigenous peoples is going to be good for everybody. When the tide rises, everything should rise with it. The tide rises, but some of us are in a kayak and some are in a cruise liner. And so my thing is to Australia is to do the right thing. It's now time. The rest of the world is watching.
Unlike Australia, most developed democracies have a long history of formally recognising their Indigenous people, from Canada to Finland to the Netherlands. And many believe this is the nation with the proudest record of all.
It's been a push that Maori people have sought since the 1800s.
Donna Hall is the most influential woman in Maoridom and a lawyer for the Maori Council. It's an advisory body that lobbies the government to prioritise Maori issues, very similar to the voice proposed for Australia.
It's a national voice for Maori to be able to articulate policy that affects all Maori, from housing, health, education, law and maintenance.
What power does the Maori Council have?
Well, it has to persuade. It has no formal ability to direct anyone. It's certainly not the New Zealand government. But its ability to persuade is very large if the arguments are put carefully and if they're right, if they're proper arguments. Most governments will actually listen.
There are dozens of buildings just like this, called maraes, scattered around New Zealand, where Maori communities gather to discuss issues that affect them. That feedback is passed up the chain to the Maori Council and then the federal government.
Has it been well done, do you think?
We'd like it to work better. What we've got, we've worked hard for. We have Maori classes, schools all over the country now that teach only in Māori. And that is an achievement. Today, when you get on a plane and fly back to Australia, you will hear the air hostesses greet you in Māori. That is what the council has brought about.
And not just a recognition of the culture, but a celebration of it, really.
A celebration, and it's great.
On top of the Maori Council, New Zealand also has a treaty and a law ensuring Maori traditions like this are preserved. In Parliament, 7 seats are set aside for Maori representatives. Rawiri Watiti is one of them.
I'm interested to know if you feel your system works. Is it effective?
We still have a long way to go, but that representation has allowed us to at least find a voice, to at least get some small gains.
By comparison, what do you make of Australia's proposal, which is essentially for an advisory body or a voice to Parliament?
It doesn't go far enough. You know, people like stepping stones, one step at a time. No. And at the end of the day, there is an example here in Aotearoa in New Zealand that goes further than an advisory.
There's a lot of fear in Australia about whether a voice could go too far.
Well, I don't think that Australia needs to really think hard about a floodgates argument because the population of the Aboriginal people is so small.
If there's one person who needs no convincing to get behind the voice, it's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who's now facing one of the biggest tests of his judgment.
Prime Minister.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good to be here.
Thanks for coming. Give me the big sell. Why should Australians support a voice to Parliament?
Because it will produce better outcomes. What programs that have been successful have in common is that they've had that sense of ownership from Indigenous people themselves. So it's about that, listening and getting better outcomes and recognition. No one will be hurt by a yes vote in this referendum.
But his Yes campaign is in big trouble. The majority of Australians plan to vote no.
You clearly have not been able to make a compelling case for the voice. And if the PM can't do it, I mean, what chance does it have?
Well, constitutional change is hard in this country. Only 8 propositions have been successful out of 48. But I'm confident that Australians will take up this opportunity to vote yes.
The Prime Minister has been heavily criticised for failing to explain exactly what he's asking Australians to vote for. But he insists it's very simple.
Who will be on the voice and how will they be elected?
The voice will be elected by Indigenous Australians themselves. It will consist of people from every state and territory and from the Torres Strait. It will have some gender balance on the voice as well as making sure that young people are elected.
But if you've already got Indigenous voices in Parliament, consulting with the communities, how is this different?
We don't have a structured national program. If we do the same thing, we should expect the same outcomes. And those outcomes are just not good enough.
But when you keep saying outcomes, I think what people don't understand is what is a practical example of how an Indigenous community or the life of an Indigenous person could be changed by the voice?
A practical example is when community health programs have involved Indigenous people themselves and they've been listened to, you have better health outcomes.
We've just spent a bit of time in Indigenous communities, Alice Springs, Tennant Creek. I've got to tell you, a lot of the locals did not know what the voice is. Those who did couldn't explain how it would work or help them.
The fact is that a range of people have been disenfranchised from participation.
I've never supported the idea of having, committees sitting in Canberra.
This is absolutely risky.
And there's a very vocal group of high-profile Indigenous people who are adamant the voice is not the answer.
We are saying no to the referendum and no to the voice.
Will Parliament be required to or obliged to listen to the voice?
There'll be no right of veto. What this does is provide for a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, but one that doesn't overturn the parliamentary structures.
So what's its power then?
Well, its power is the power of voice.
There's a bit of tension in that messaging though, because on one hand you're saying this is a huge, historic, really significant change that we need, and on the other hand, it doesn't go too far. It won't really substantially impact most people's lives. I mean, how can both those things be true?
Well, it can be true because for most non-Indigenous Australians, it won't impact the way that Parliament functions, the things that have a direct impact on their lives. But it just might make it better for the most disadvantaged group in Australian society, for our Indigenous Australians.
Anthony Albanese is facing his first test as Prime Minister on the...
Just over a year into his first term, the gloss is wearing off the Albanese government.
The Prime Minister in a Ukrainian war zone, trying to comprehend the atrocities that took place.
As our globe-trotting PM juggles foreign policy with a barrage of domestic woes.
What keeps Anthony Albanese up at night? What are you most worried about?
I think international events that are beyond our control. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has had an impact on cost of living here with global inflation. So issues like that, but it's a great responsibility that I feel.
I bet.
Of being Prime Minister was something that growing up wasn't on my agenda, far from it. But it's an incredible honour as well.
You got a lot of people coming to you with a lot of problems. Would you consider delaying this referendum until cost of living, inflation, all of those things are under control, until it can be more of a priority?
Well, the legislation has been passed. It went through the Parliament with overwhelming support. This is now in the hands of the Australian people.
Let me put it to you this way. If Labor was polling 41% and the Liberal Party had 48%, would you call an election? Would you go to the polls?
This is not about party politics. This is actually about...
That's a fair comparison.
No, this isn't about party politics. This is about improving the lives of Indigenous Australians.
But this is your credibility on the line, Prime Minister.
Well, it's not about me. It's not about any politician.
Well, it is about you. You're the Prime Minister. This is your product. It's your job to sell it.
No, it's not my
and
product.
You want to win.
It's a product that came from Indigenous Australians, and it's one that I support.
You keep saying to me this isn't your product. It isn't your campaign. You've been in politics a long time. You know that if it fails, of course it's political and it will have an impact on your legacy either way.
I'm concerned about the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That is my only concern.
Do you have a plan B?
My plan is to be successful at this referendum, and I'm determined. I'm determined to stand up for my values, and I have faith in the Australian people.
The Prime Minister says the voice to Parliament is about bringing Australians together. And isn't that what everyone wants?
Well, I think, in contrast, it's demonstrated that it's split Australia down the middle.
For an idea that was intended to unite the nation, there's no doubt it has in fact divided opinion, even among our Indigenous leaders. Coalition Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price is hoping the referendum won't succeed.
What I can say is, as I've asked the government for, can they guarantee this will impact one life or do anything to save one life? And some of the response I've got is, it provides hope. Well, hope makes you feel warm and fuzzy, but hope doesn't stop a kid from being sexually abused. Hope doesn't end the violence in communities. Hope doesn't feed a mouth. You know, we've got to be practical.
But is hope better than nothing?
Well, I don't think we're dealing with nothing.
But Noel Pearson, a fierce advocate for the voice, still has hope and says failure is too terrible to contemplate.
We can only win with love. There's no other way.
Do you think there's enough love in Australia?
I think there's enough love. We're asking you to trust us, and we're putting faith in you. Our faith is in you, the Australian people. This is about our country, and we've got to get it right.
Hello, I'm Amelia Adams. Thanks for watching 60 Minutes Australia. Subscribe to our channel now for our brand new stories and exclusive clips every week. And don't miss out on our extra minute segments and full episodes of 60 Minutes on 9now.com.au and the 9Now app.